Well, hi there, and welcome back to Her Shrink Ray Eye. I'm Joan Biediger, and I want to begin with something very small, because that feels appropriate for this episode. There's a small moment that happens with most miniatures, and it can be easy to miss because it looks so ordinary. Someone walks up to the piece. At first, they're standing at a normal viewing distance, taking in the overall shape of it, the base, the box, the main figure, the light, or whatever first announces the scene. They may understand the subject right away, or they may only sense that something is being held inside this small, constructed space. Then something changes. The viewer leans in, they lower their head slightly, shift to one side, or look through an opening into a corner they could not see at first. Maybe they're trying to see around an object in the foreground. Maybe they're trying to find the place where the scene begins to make sense. The miniature hasn't moved. The figure hasn't changed position. The paint hasn't changed. The wall, the figure, the light, and the edge of the box, if it's a box, are all exactly where they were a second ago. But the relationship has changed. Miniature work is often discussed as if the object itself contains the whole experience. We talk about sculpting, painting, construction, accuracy, composition, story, mood, subject, and techniques. All of that matters. But a miniature does something else too. It waits for a viewer. And when the viewer arrives, the work is activated in a particular way. A miniature can be finished on the bench. It can be painted, lit, based, photographed, titled, and placed on a table. But as an experience, it's not quite complete until someone encounters it. The viewer is not an invisible camera floating in front of the scene. They arrive with a body, a height, a distance, and a position. And sometimes the most important thing about the miniature is not a painted object at all. It's where the viewer has been placed. That is the territory of this episode, not storytelling exactly, although story may be involved, not illusion exactly, although illusion certainly matters, not the uncanny, although the viewer's position can sometimes feel uneasy or exposed. This episode is about encounter. It's about what happens when a miniature asks the viewer to move closer, change angle, peer into the space, and become aware of their own position in relation to the small world in front of them. The miniature doesn't move, but it can make the viewer move. And once that happens, the viewer has already begun to become part of the scene. Miniatures are sometimes talked about as though they are simply reduced versions of larger things. A smaller figure, a smaller building, a smaller version of something that could exist at full size. But that's only part of what a miniature is. A miniature is also an arrangement made for looking. It's not only a small world, it's a small world positioned in relation to a viewer. That distinction is important because no one sees a miniature from nowhere. There is always a viewing position, even when the maker has not thought much about it. And for me, that's a part of making miniatures that I don't really think about that much. The viewer might be looking down from above, straight in from the front, through a small opening in a box, or across the edge of a base. Those positions are not neutral. They shape the meaning before the viewer has named every object or understood every detail. A miniature seen from above can feel like an arrangement. The viewer understands the layout, they can see how the objects relate to each other. They may read the space almost the way a map is read, as a set of relationships made visible from a distance. That can be useful, and sometimes it's exactly what the piece needs. But a miniature seen at eye level behaves differently. The viewer is no longer simply supervising the scene from above. The eye begins to enter the space. A doorway can feel taller. A figure may feel more present. A room may begin to hold atmosphere instead of simply displaying its contents. Imagine a small room with a chair, a table, a lamp, and maybe a coat hanging near the door. Seen from above, the room might read almost like a plan. The viewer understands where everything is. The table is here, the chair is there, the coat is against the wall. But from eye level, the chair may begin to block part of the table. The lamp creates a pocket of light. The coat becomes something glimpsed rather than simply identified. Seen through a doorway, that same room changes again. Now the viewer is not only looking at a room, they are outside looking in. There is a particular power in that position. The viewer can see into the space without quite being exposed to it. They have access without belonging. The room hasn't changed. The objects haven't changed, but the viewer's relationship to them has changed. The doorway creates a threshold. It limits access. It makes the room feel less like an exposed arrangement and more like a place the viewer has encountered from a particular point. That kind of placement can make a scene feel private, maybe theatrical, discovered, or withheld without changing a single object inside it. Depending on that position, the viewer may feel like a witness, an intruder, or someone standing at the edge of an invitation. This is where the viewer begins to matter as more than an audience. The viewer's role is often established before they consciously understand the subject. Before they read the title, before they identify every object, before they know what the maker intended, they already feel something about where they've been placed. Are they above the scene, outside it, looking into it, held at the threshold, or invited closer? Those questions are not minor. They shape the entire encounter. And once we start thinking this way, the question changes. It's no longer only what is in the scene. It becomes where does the viewer stand in relation to it. The viewer arrives somewhere. That is where the encounter begins. Scale does something peculiar to the viewer. It does not only make the scene smaller, it makes the viewer's own body more noticeable. We usually begin by thinking about the reduced world in front of us, the small figure, the tiny room. But the longer you spend with miniatures, the more you realize that smallness also changes the person looking. In a full-sized room, our body belongs to the same system as everything around it. A chair is made for a body like ours. A doorway assumes we can pass through it. Even before we think about it, the room tells us how we fit. A miniature does not do that. It may show us a chair or a table or a door or a window, but none of those things can actually receive us. They resemble objects made for the human body, but not for our body as it exists in that moment. So the viewer is caught in a contradiction. The scene may feel human, but the viewer cannot belong to it physically. We know what it means to sit at a table, stand in a doorway, or reach toward a workbench, but our actual body is too large to take part. That difference makes the viewer physically important in a way they usually are not. A face close to a miniature room becomes enormous by comparison. A hand could cover half the scene. A shadow can fall across the work and change what's visible. Even the act of leaning closer or shifting slightly to one side changes the relationship between the viewer and the small world in front of them. That disproportion gives the viewer a kind of power. I don't mean that in a dramatic or sinister way, although some miniatures could certainly use it that way. I mean the simple fact that the viewer has a level of access that would be impossible at full size. In a real workshop, you can't see the whole room, the surface of the bench, the far corner, and the space under the shelf all at once. Your body limits what you can know, but a miniature lets you take in a world from a position no full-size room would allow. A small private room, especially one without a figure in it, can make the viewer feel almost too present. We're outside the room, but we can still inspect it. We're too large to belong, yet close enough to notice intimate details. There is also a kind of looking that happens with miniatures that feels almost tactile. The eye does not only identify objects, it moves across surfaces. It follows the grain of a wall, the roughness of groundwork, the edge of a worn floorboard, the tiny irregularities that make the scene feel handled rather than merely seen. The viewer is not touching the miniature, but the eye starts behaving as if touch were nearby. That may be one reason close viewing can feel so intimate. The body stays outside the scene, but the surface begins to matter as something almost felt. That kind of close looking also connects to another useful term, peripersonal space. It refers to the space immediately around the body, the area close enough that seeing and possible action begin to overlap. It's the space of reaching, handling, avoiding, and sometimes choosing not to touch. Miniatures often sit directly inside that zone. They're not distant images on a wall. They're close enough to the hand. We could reach towards them. We could cover them. We could damage them. We could move something if the rules of the object allowed it. But usually we do not. So the miniature occupies a strange position. It's near enough to feel physically available, but not available in the ordinary way. That may be part of why close looking can feel so charged. The viewer's body is not only outside the miniature world, it's close enough to matter. And often people are at a show looking at someone else's work, and we've been conditioned and we know we can reach out and touch that miniature, but we don't because that's kind of a taboo. You don't pick up somebody's miniature. You don't reach out and touch it, but it's close enough to do it. That interesting space that we hold between being able to touch something but knowing you can't, That's why I think scale in miniature work is more than just accuracy. What happens to the viewer when those familiar things are made too small to use? A tiny chair does not only tell us that the chair's been reduced, it changes the meaning of our own body near it. The viewer's body becomes part of the meaning because it's always the wrong size. That tension is one of the things miniature work keeps returning us to. And when a maker understands that, scale becomes a way of positioning the viewer emotionally. The miniature does not exist at human scale, but the viewer does. They don't merge, but they press against each other. And that pressure changes what the scene can mean. There is a difference between seeing a space and entering it. Miniatures live in that difference. They give us rooms, streets, workshops, doorways, and windows. They give us many of the cues we associate with spaces that could be occupied. We recognize the forms. We understand how bodies would move through them, but we can't go there. A miniature space is not only an image of a space, it has real edges, real depth, real shadows, and real surfaces. A painted room on a canvas may suggest depth, but a miniature room is physically there as an object. And because it occupies actual space, the eye begins to behave as if entry were possible. It follows the floor toward the back wall. It moves through the doorway. It tests the distance between the chair and the table. It imagines what might be around the corner, even when there is no real corner to turn. The eye enters where the body can't. A tiny doorway can be more compelling than a fully open room for exactly this reason. The doorway gives us access, but not too much. It says there is a space beyond this edge, and we are allowed to look into it, but we're not allowed to possess it completely. That partial access can make a small space feel more convincing than a completely exposed one. When everything is visible, the room can become an arrangement. When part of the room is held back, the viewer has to imagine more than the object physically shows. The unseen portion begins to matter. A darkened doorway can make a room feel larger than its actual dimensions. A hallway that can't actually continue may still feel as if it does, because the viewer's eye accepts the invitation to go farther than the miniature can literally allow. Unlike full-scale immersive work, a miniature can't surround the body. Instead, it creates inwardness. It concentrates the viewer's attention inside a small, bounded world. It asks the viewer to enter by narrowing focus rather than by walking through space. The viewer doesn't enter with the whole body. They enter through attention, memory, and spatial imagination. We know the feeling of sitting in a chair, crossing a room, reaching for that handle. The miniature activates those bodily memories at a scale we can't physically occupy. And that kind of entry does not have to be purely visual. Tactile models, audio description, and accessible diorama work remind us that a person can build a mental scene through touch, sound, and spatial description, as well as sight. The larger point is not simply that the eye enters where the body can't. It's that a miniature creates a structured encounter, and different bodies may enter that encounter in different ways. That mismatch gives the work its charge. The scene says, you know this kind of space. The scale says, but not like this. That's why an ordinary miniature room can feel strange without being surreal. A table is ordinary, a doorway is ordinary. But when those things are small, close, and unreachable, they become newly visible. We have to renegotiate our relationship to them, not as usable objects, but as spaces of attention. So when I say the viewer becomes part of the scene, I don't literally mean the viewer enters the miniature. They can't. But the miniature gives the viewer a threshold, and the viewer's attention crosses it. The body remains outside, the eye moves forward, and the experience happens in that tension. Sometimes the strongest presence in a miniature is created by absence. Not emptiness exactly, but absence. There is a difference. An empty area can feel unused, unfinished, or simply open. Absence feels more specific. It suggests that something or someone belongs there and is not there now. Miniatures can use that feeling beautifully because small spaces are so sensitive to placement. A tiny room does not need much to change its emotional direction. A simple example would be a small room with a table and 2 chairs. If both chairs are occupied by figures, the viewer may feel like they're observing a relationship inside the scene. The emotional focus is between the figures. The viewer looks at posture, distance, the objects between them, and tries to understand what's happening. But if one chair is occupied and the other is empty, the whole arrangement changes. Now the empty chair has weight. It does not simply mean no one is sitting there. It suggests a missing person, an expected person, or someone whose absence matters. The important thing is that the empty place begins to organize the looking. The viewer notices the person who's present, but also the position that is not filled. And because the viewer is standing outside the scene, looking toward that empty place, something subtle happens. The empty chair may begin to feel like an invitation or an accusation or maybe a question. The viewer is not literally meant to sit there. The scale makes that impossible, but the composition has created a place that the viewer can mentally occupy. It becomes a kind of implied participation. This is where I think miniature work can become very powerful. The scene does not have to point at the viewer. It doesn't have to include a mirror or a figure staring outward. It doesn't have to announce you're part of this. Sometimes it only has to leave a position open enough that the viewer feels addressed by it. And addressed is not the same as welcomed. A miniature does not have to make the viewer feel invited in any comfortable sense. It only has to make the viewer feel placed. Sometimes the position left open for the viewer is uneasy. The viewer may feel as though they have arrived too late, or maybe they're too early, or as though they're standing where someone else should be. A scene can make the viewer feel implicated without becoming theatrical about it. A miniature may show an ordinary room, a street corner, or a quiet figure. But if the composition leaves a place for the viewer, the scene begins to feel as though it's meeting us, not explaining itself to us, but meeting us. Restraint matters here. It's tempting, especially when an idea is strong, to underline it, to make the empty chair very clearly symbolic, to make the missing figure too readable. But miniatures often gain power when the viewer feels the implication before they can fully explain it. the viewer becomes part of the scene, not because the miniature includes a literal representation of them, but because the scene creates a place their attention can enter. Sometimes that place is welcoming, sometimes it's uncomfortable, sometimes it's simply open enough that the viewer can't remain entirely detached. A miniature that does this well does not only ask, "What do you see?" It asks, "Where are you in relation to what you see?" This is the place where photographs become complicated. Most of us see far more miniatures in photographs than we ever see in person. That is not a complaint, it's simply the reality of how miniature work circulates now. Photographs let us share work across distance, but a photograph also changes the encounter. The photograph chooses the viewer's position before the viewer arrives. It chooses the angle, the distance, the crop, the light, and the frame. That means the viewer is no longer negotiating with the miniature as an object in space. The body drops out. The viewer no longer has to lean in, bend down, step slightly to one side, or find the angle where the piece begins to open up for them. The camera has already done that work. It may have found a beautiful view, even the best view, but it's also removed the viewer's search from the experience. A photograph can make a miniature feel more complete than it feels in person. It can make a shallow space seem deeper or enlarge a detail until the actual scale relationship becomes harder to sense. On a screen, the miniature may no longer feel miniature at all. It may simply become an image. A box diorama is a good example. In a photograph, the camera can look directly into the box. The opening becomes the edge of the image. The room inside may look beautifully composed, and the viewer sees what the camera has been allowed to see. But in person, the viewer has to approach the box. They have to find the opening. They may have to adjust their height or distance. They may become aware of the box as a container, not just as a picture. In a photograph, that boundary may disappear into the composition. In person, it can become part of the meaning. The viewer feels the fact that they're outside looking in. So I don't think the important distinction is simply between a good photograph and a bad photograph. The more interesting distinction is between a chosen view and a found view. A photographed miniature can say, "Here is the view," while a physical miniature has to deal with the viewer searching for the view. It's the difference between being shown a doorway and standing at one. In the first case, the view is delivered. In the second, the viewer has to locate themselves in relation to the object. They have to discover where their eye belongs. But photographs and physical miniatures create different kinds of encounters. The photograph gives the viewer a selected frame. The physical miniature asks the viewer to locate themselves in relation to an object. And if the viewer's position is part of what gives meaning to the miniature, then that difference is not minor. A photograph can preserve an image of the miniature. The physical miniature can preserve in memory the experience of having been there with it. The feeling of leaning in the moment the opening lined up, the realization that the room felt different from a lower angle, the sense that the object was not just about being seen, but encountered. That is the part that becomes flattened when everything becomes only a photograph. Not completely, but the viewer's body has been removed from the encounter. And for this episode, that's enough to matter. If the viewer's position matters, then display matters. That sounds practical, and it is, but it's also more than practical. Display is not simply the final step after the real work is done. It's the condition under which the viewer meets the miniature. Even the simplest presentation creates a relationship. A small interior placed too low may force the viewer into an overhead view, even if the piece was meant to be experienced from the front. The maker may have built a room that depends on looking through a doorway, but if the piece sits below the viewer's natural line of sight, the first thing people see may be the top edges, the floor plan, the seams, or the general diorama structure. If the emotional center of the work depends on threshold, privacy, or looking into a space, then the display height can really weaken the whole effect. Lighting works the same way. Light doesn't only reveal the work, it tells the viewer where to look and how far into the scene they're being asked to go. A single light inside a miniature room can pull the light inward. It can make the space feel inhabited beyond what is immediately visible. But light that flattens everything into equal visibility can remove the path. The viewer can see more but may feel less. More visibility is not always more meaning. Sometimes the viewer needs to see enough, not everything. A box diorama, for example, may restrict the viewer's movement. It may say, this is the opening. This is where you look. This is the frame through which the world appears. The miniature begins before the viewer reaches the back wall. It begins at the point of access. A quiet piece can still hold attention if the display gives the viewer a way in. But if the viewer has to fight the display before they can meet the work, the encounter may be weakened before the piece has a chance. Viewers do not all enter a piece in the same way. One person may stop at the first read and move on, and another may lean in, shift position, return to the front, then notice something the first view didn't reveal. Museum studies often treat this kind of self-directed movement as part of how visitors engage with displays. People choose distance, pace, dwell time, and interpretive path. Miniatures work the same way on a smaller scale. A good display does not have to force one response, but it should support the viewer who wants to move from first glance into closer attention. There is a difference between meaningful distance and accidental distance. Meaningful distance is built into the work. It helps the viewer understand their position. It might hold them outside a private room, keep them at the edge of a threshold, or make them aware that they're looking into something they can't fully enter. Accidental distance is different. It comes from poor access, awkward height, bad lighting, or a display condition that fights the piece. The viewer may still be outside, but now they're outside because they can't get close enough to encounter the work properly. Sometimes the best view is simply too hard to find. The maker may know exactly where the piece comes alive. They've seen it from that angle many times while building. They know the little line of sight through the doorway or the back wall that catches the light, or the height where the scene suddenly makes sense. But the viewer doesn't know that. The viewer arrives cold. That first encounter does not have to explain everything, but it has to offer enough orientation that the viewer feels there's something worth approaching. If the viewer feels only confusion, awkwardness, or blocked access, they may keep searching. There's a difference between mystery and obscurity. Mystery gives the viewer a reason to continue. Obscurity gives the viewer no foothold. The gap has to feel reachable. If the viewer senses that another layer is there, they may keep looking. If the gap feels too large or too arbitrary, the invitation turns into frustration a lot of times. This is why explanation can be tricky. A title or statement can deepen the experience, but it can't fully repair a broken encounter. It should not have to create the experience from nothing. A miniature can be beautifully made, but the viewer still has to meet it somewhere. Display creates that somewhere. When display works well, it can almost disappear. The viewer doesn't think, "What a successful display strategy." They simply feel drawn in. They find the view. They understand how to approach. Their body and attention fall into the relationship the piece has prepared. The miniature is not only what's been made, it's also the way the viewer is allowed to arrive. When we talk about the viewer becoming part of the scene, it's easy to imagine the obvious version. A figure staring straight out at us. A mirror that catches the viewer's reflection. A peephole, a forced perspective trick, a hidden angle. Some little theatrical device that makes the viewer say, "Oh, I see, I'm part of it." Those things can work. I don't want to dismiss them. Sometimes a direct device is exactly what the piece needs, and it's exactly what you want. A mirror or a peephole can be effective if it belongs to the emotional logic of the miniature. But those devices can also become too easy. They can announce the idea before the viewer has actually felt it. For me, the more interesting version is usually quieter. The viewer matters because the scene has been built around their position, not because the piece tells them that they matter. The scene does not need to include a little stand-in for the viewer. It does not need a modeled spectator whose job is to tell us where to look or how to feel. Sometimes the actual viewer is enough. The miniature can create a position through framing, sightlines, openings, and withheld spaces, and the viewer steps into that position imaginatively without needing to be represented inside the scene. A miniature doesn't have to become interactive in a literal way to involve the viewer. The viewer doesn't need to touch anything, move anything, open anything, or trigger anything. Participation can begin much earlier than that. It can begin with the feeling that the viewer's position changes the work. This is where restraint matters. The maker has to give the viewer enough direction to enter the piece, but not so much that the encounter becomes mechanical. There's a difference between legibility and participation. Legibility means the viewer can understand what they're seeing. Participation means the viewer's looking changes the experience. This is one way to keep viewer participation from becoming gimmicky. The question should not begin with a device. It should begin with the viewer's position. That position may never need to be stated in the title or the description, but if the maker understands it, the piece may become more coherent. The problem often starts with the device. What if I add a mirror? What if I make the viewer look through a hole? What if I hide something that can only be seen from one angle? Those can be great ideas, but they become stronger when they answer a deeper question. What does that device do to the viewer's position? Does the mirror make the viewer feel implicated? Or does it only call attention to itself? Does the peephole make the scene feel private? Or does it merely make the viewer notice the peephole? The device should serve the relationship. Otherwise, the viewer may remember the trick more than the piece. I think the stronger question is not how do I surprise the viewer? It's how do I place the viewer? The strongest viewer participation may be almost invisible. Just a carefully made scene that understands where the viewer is, what they can see, what they can't enter, and how their attention might move through the space. That's not gimmickry. That's a composition extended into encounter. So I want to return to that small moment from the beginning. A viewer walks up to the miniature. At first, they see the whole thing from whatever distance the room gives them. Then they move. Not dramatically, they simply make one of those small adjustments that viewers make when a piece has caught them. The miniature itself hasn't changed, but the relationship changes. The viewer has found a position inside the encounter. And once we see that, the viewer becomes harder to treat as an afterthought. The viewer is not simply the person who arrives at the end after the real work is done. The viewer is one of the conditions the work has been waiting for. The maker decides what's present, what's withheld, what's reachable by the eye, and what remains outside the viewer's grasp. But those decisions become alive in relation to another person's attention. That is where the miniature begins to include the viewer without needing to name them. It gives them a place, and maybe that's why certain miniatures stay with us. Not only because of what they showed, but because of where they made us stand. We remember the little room because we looked into it. We remember the figure because we tilted our head to look at it from a particular angle. The maker builds the conditions. The viewer completes the experience. Not by adding anything physical, not by solving the work, not by becoming the subject, but by arriving with a body, a scale, an eye, and a willingness to look. That's enough. The scene may be small, the figure may be small, but the act of looking is not. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a fellow hobbyist. Subscribe, follow, or simply take a little time to listen when you can. I appreciate every person who joins me here. And I'll be right here with my lamp on, brush in hand, story waiting. Before I sign off today, I want to thank the Shepherd Payne Education Fund for their support of this podcast and their commitment to education in the miniature arts. Until next time, keep your hands steady, see clearly, nod obediently, and keep your story your own. Thanks for listening.